President Trump. When he walked into the room, he walked right past the Attorney General, Letitia James, who was seated to his left, did not look at her, did not say anything to her. He walked to his chair and he sat down. The opening arguments played out from both sides. The government made a case that Trump and his associates for years have committed fraud in their view, especially in terms of valuation of the Trump organization and its related properties. During the course of that opening argument by the government, I watched as Trump had his arms folded across his chest. He leaned toward the table. He seemed to grimace. He definitely shook his head a few times as he listened to the government present in a PowerPoint scenario how they believe Trump committed fraud, and they showed different elements of depositions and images of the properties. Trump's son Eric sat just a few rows in front of me behind his father. And during Trump's opening argument, his lawyer went up there and said that the valuations of these properties are subjective at times, are not perfectly done by any organization, and for the government to claim it was fraudulent, that he had certain valuations, isn't going to pass muster. But as you said, this is a judge-based case. There's no jury in this room. At the end of the day, the judge has every say here in terms of how it proceeds and what's ultimately the ruling.
Judge, no jury. I understand, too, Bob, that former President Trump is appearing voluntarily in court. Is that to help his case, to help his campaign? Why is that?
As you saw on the third floor here at the courthouse, when the former president, the Republican frontrunner, walked in, he stopped and talked to cameras. He talked to reporters. And it's notable that Trump was followed into the courtroom by two of his top political advisors, Jason Miller, who's a key spokesman for the Trump campaign, and Stephen Chung, another spokesman for the Trump campaign. And they were outside here in the New York courthouse area speaking to reporters earlier, and they sat there during the entire proceeding, during the opening arguments section of this civil trial. And that's a projection that this is not just a legal matter for Trump as he deals with the future of his own businesses here in New York. This is a political war for him. He is battling the Attorney General, he is battling the judge, and he's battling to keep his place in the Republican presidential race.
So then, Bob, since you bring up the Republican presidential race, let's linger there for a moment. What impact could this civil trial, amid all the other trials and potential trials that we could see this election season, how might it impact his run for president?
Is that it? Some candidates who are running against Trump, like former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, they've taken on the issue of Trump's finances before on the campaign trail and been hypercritical that Trump has had, in their view, fraudulent business practices and committed fraud, or at least lied about how much he's worth, his net worth. But most Republican candidates who are seeking the nomination are not going at Trump about his legal challenges. They're not taking him on about his federal indictment or about what's happening here on a civil level in New York. Instead, they're trying to focus on their own messages, in part based on my conversations with them and their top advisors, is they do not want to alienate the Trump voter. They believe that even if these legal burdens ultimately become too much for Trump to become the nominee, they still want to win over that Trump coalition. So you're seeing a very careful Republican field right now, though as they linger in the single digits, it's tough for them to really find a path forward at this point.
All right, Bob Costas, thank you very much. Appreciate it, Bob.
Your critics say that it's time to ruin Mr. Trump's chances in the election.
Well, that's absolutely not true. Justice Department prosecutors are nonpartisan. They don't allow partisan considerations to play any role in their determination.
That, of course, is U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland talking about the Justice Department's two indictments against the former president on the latest episode of 60 Minutes. The U.S. Attorney General also weighed in on the Justice Department's recent indictment of Hunter Biden on 3 felony gun charges.
The allegation is...
There was a lot in this interview, and a reminder, you can watch 60 Minutes on Sundays at 7 p.m. Eastern on CBS, and viewers can also stream it on Paramount+. President Biden is pushing Congress to get to work on a long-term funding bill after a shutdown was only narrowly avoided.
He signed a bipartisan deal over the weekend, which funds the government, but just through mid-November. It won't support, it won't, what was that?
It won.
It won. It won support from more Democrats than Republicans in the House, with 90 Republicans voting no. One House GOP lawmaker says he'll attempt to oust Kevin McCarthy this week. That's Matt Gaetz.
CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang joins us now. Weijia, thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it. So, if you could hold our hand and walk us through this deal, how it came together so quickly and on the weekend, no less.
Tony and Lily, it's always great to see you. And it came together very quickly because it had to, because there was no more time to play with, even though these Republicans had been infighting for weeks and they were trying to find a way to keep the government open. They were down to the wire. And it was a surprise for, I would say, most people, especially here in Washington, even those of us who cover it closely, because it appeared that this small faction of hardline conservatives were going to continue holding out, but there was a reversal to keep the government open. And as you mentioned, this was ultimately a huge bipartisan effort. But as you also mentioned, one thing it does not include, which is going to be, I think, the topic of conversation for the next 40-some days until the money runs out again, is Ukraine funding, and that is not included. And so perhaps that was certainly one of the things that Republicans wanted to do, was to decouple keeping the government open, the funding for that, and also continuous funding for Ukraine. And so, yes, you're right. It happened. The president signed it with just minutes to spare, and it was really apparent that even the White House was preparing for a shutdown. And so this was, I think, a happy development for the White House that certainly didn't want to deal with millions of federal workers not being paid as they continued to work. Guys.
Weijia, you were talking about Ukraine funding. There's also the issue of the border, which, we heard Kevin McCarthy talk to Margaret Brennan yesterday about what it is exactly that they would want to see. That includes a border wall, fewer people getting asylum, or the possibility of even asking for asylum. So what else is in the line between now and mid-November? And what does President Biden want to see lawmakers get to when it comes to that funding that's needed between now and then?
So President Biden has made very clear he is urging lawmakers to find a way to continue to provide funding for Ukraine. He has long talked about the consequences of what happens if that money runs out and Putin wins, and what that means not only for that war, but for the rest of the world, as, of course, China is very closely watching. And so you're right in that Ukraine will be, I think, the top of the conversation. But it's interesting because McCarthy suggested that, Republicans would be open to having that conversation if border security funding was tied to it. He, said that, of course, we want to have funding for our own borders when we're talking about funding another government. And so the White House argues that that wasn't the case before, that McCarthy and Biden had already talked about funding for Ukraine that didn't include this attachment of border security. But when you are factoring in all the different voices, all the different demands, it's not surprising that that goalpost has changed. But certainly from the White House's perspective, that funding for Ukraine is the most important thing to focus on.
Weijia, tonight on America Decides, you'll, of course, be talking about Florida Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz and his threat to file a motion to remove Kevin McCarthy as Speaker. The question that people have been trying to figure out the answer to is, does Gaetz have the support and the maneuvering capability to actually get McCarthy out of a job? What do you know at this hour?
Well, as you very well know, Scott McFarlane probably has the numbers and the whips memorized from talking to all of the lawmakers every day up there. So we will have him on to talk about the latest. But it appears that so far it is a possibility, but it also looks like it's going to be really difficult to actually remove McCarthy. First, pretty much all Democrats would have to be on board in the chamber also to vote, because the vote is not based on just the numbers, but on who is there that day. So the Democrats would have to show up to vote to oust him. And then there's this big question of, well, if you do remove McCarthy, who in the Republican caucus, because it has to be a Republican since they hold the majority in the House, who would replace him? And there is no heir apparent right now, so that's a big unknown. And it really is just a small group led by Matt Gaetz who is really leading the charge here anyway. And so they're the ones that have to be convinced to do otherwise, which is a lot easier than to convince the whole rest of the House to vote against McCarthy. That said, you never say never until the votes are called. But we don't even know if we're going to get to the point at this point of voting to oust him. There's a procedural step in between that lawmakers have to vote on first. And so we will dive into all of that to see just how much of a threat McCarthy's job is at right now.
So not that simple. Weijia Zhang, thanks for breaking it all for us to understand. You can watch America Decides at 5 p.m. Eastern right here on CBS News. Governor Gavin Newsom has named Democratic strategist LaFonza Butler to fill the seat of the late Senator Dianne Feinstein. Butler is the president of the political organization Emily's List. She's the first woman of color to hold that position. She was also an advisor to Vice President Kamala Harris's presidential campaign. Senator Feinstein died on Friday after spending more than 3 decades in the Senate. She was also mayor of San Francisco. The senator will lie in state at the San Francisco City Hall on Wednesday before her funeral that will take place on Thursday. She was 90 years old.
The Supreme Court returns for a new term today, with justices slated to consider a handful of major cases. Second Amendment, gun rights, and federal regulations cases are on the docket, plus 2 cases involving local lawmakers who block some of their constituents on social media. Abortion may also be back before the High Court as lawsuits over the medication mifepristone work their way through the lower courts, on their way probably to the Supreme. State laws banning gender-affirming care for minors also on a path toward the nation's High Court.
Their discovery helped end the pandemic. We'll tell you about the special prize for a pair of scientists who created the technology behind the COVID vaccine.
And in Washington, the deal is done, but the budget battle just beginning. How the White House is working to get more military aid for Ukraine. McCarthy tells CBS News he's confident he will survive an attempt by conservative Matt Gaetz to have him removed from his speaker position. Gaetz says he will introduce a motion to remove McCarthy after the speaker struck a deal with Democrats to avert a government shutdown.
It's the first Monday of October, and that means the start of the new session for the U.S. Supreme Court. Many of this year's high-profile cases are appeals of rulings on abortion, gun rights that were made by the Fifth Circuit Court in Texas, among others.
Former President Donald Trump is attending the beginning of a New York State civil fraud trial against his family-owned businesses. New York State Attorney General Letitia James claims that the Trump Organization repeatedly committed fraud on financial statements, all in order to secure business loans and insurance policies. Trump dismissed the case as a witch hunt and called the AG a racist.
Jessica Levinson joins us now. She's a CBS News legal contributor and a professor at Loyola Law School in California, always explaining the law and the thinking of the Supreme Court. So the judge, Jessica, presiding over this case, already found Trump and others liable for fraud last week. Why was this ruling delivered before, and how can it impact
this is so confusing
whole
to me.
trial? Because no jury. There's a judge. He's there voluntarily. There's already a ruling.
He's on camera today looking very smiley and goofy with his gray hair. This is all very unusual. So he says stuff before he heard the arguments based on the paper documents? Please explain. I'll butt out of it. Sorry.
No, these are great questions, and it is confusing. And in fact, the former president's trial team said, Your Honor, no offense, but could you tell us exactly what this trial looks like? Essentially acknowledging that he had already found that Trump and Trump organizations had engaged in fraud. Now, I know this sounds strange, but it's actually not unusual if the trial proceeds as I think it will, which is that there was already a finding of liability, either in whole or in part. And now the rest of the trial will be about the amount of damages and the remedies. Now, this is a bench trial.
Sorry, it's a little bit distracting.
We're seeing the video of the judge.
Just smiling and taking off his glasses.
It's like a family reunion shot. It's very strange footage from inside a courtroom. First of all, we're not used to seeing Donald Trump at a table in a courtroom flanked by lawyers. Letitia James is there in the background. His son is over his other shoulder. These pictures are just very... I don't believe we've seen them before. Correct me if I'm wrong.
We haven't seen this before. And what will be really interesting is, of course, the former president is facing other cases. This is a civil fraud case. He's also facing criminal cases. It'll be really interesting to see how he comports himself in the Georgia criminal case, because that's the only criminal case that will be televised. This is our first insight into how he comports himself in a courtroom during a full trial. As you said, a confusing one, but a trial that is essentially based on how much money is he going to have to pay, and will he have to stop doing business either entirely or in part in New York.
So, Jessica, let's talk a little bit about what Donald Trump's legal team is arguing. And I'm reminded as I recount their argument, which I'll do in a second, when Donald Trump was asked in the 2016 campaign about not paying taxes, he said that makes me smart, paying as little as possible, even maybe skirting the law. And in this case, you've got his legal team arguing that the fact that he overvalued certain things is proof that he's a, quote, genius. And then secondly, in the court of public opinion, the argument that this is a victimless crime. The banks got paid. The insurance companies got paid.
The Trump organization got paid.
Everybody's doing fine on this. So there's no victim. And being clever with your paperwork and getting a better deal makes you smart in business, not a criminal or not a civil fraudster. That's their argument. What do you make of that?
So it's interesting because the attorney general, that was almost the first thing they argued. They said, this is not a victimless crime. So a couple of responses. One, there is a big difference between using legal loopholes, between pushing the limit, between trying to pay as little as you possibly can in taxes in a legal way and crossing that line and actually committing tax evasion or defrauding a bank or defrauding a loan company. And so I know that what the former president is trying to argue is, I'm just a genius. Again, a difference between legally exploiting loopholes and crossing that line over into civil liability. The other thing is, I think that this is kind of common in white collar cases where people feel like, well, who was actually hurt? Nobody was beaten. Nobody was murdered. Nobody was directly burglarized. And I think the answer is, people actually were burglarized in a different way, and that when people do actually commit civil fraud, that there is an impact, and that we all pay, for instance, higher bank fees. We all pay our insurance companies higher fees, that we all pay when it comes to tax evasion, that we have to absorb the money that somebody else gained by ill-gotten gains, and that ends up, again, not as direct as actually punching somebody in the face, but it ends up hurting people in a direct.
Đã quay trở lại với kênh của tôi. Hôm nay tôi lại giới thiệu với anh em tiếp về một chiếc máy bơm công suất lớn. Chiếc máy này dùng có thể rửa xe, ô tô, xe máy và các loại xe mà bị bụi bẩn. Anh em đi trời mưa, trời nắng mà bị bẩn thì hãy dùng chiếc máy này. Và đây là chiếc máy tôi đang dùng. Là chiếc máy bơm rửa xe, dùng để rửa xe cho gia đình tôi. Nếu anh em nào mà lười, không cần mà lười ra quán hoặc là nghĩ mà ra quán thì nghĩa là rửa thì sẽ sạch hơn. Mình ở nhà thì mình tiện, mình có máy bơm như này, mình có thể mình rửa xe, rửa phao cũng được, tắm chó, tắm trùng đấy. Đây hôm nay tôi sẽ dùng chiếc máy bơm này để tôi tắm cho hai chú chó của tôi. Chuồng của họ cũng quá bẩn rồi, có trắng này thì là khá. Đấy. Này thì có công suất rất lớn. Đây là một chế độ này là để phun rửa xe, và một chế độ nữa thì để mình phải xoáy ra như này. Đấy là để nó có thể kéo ra. Đấy, thì là phun xương như này, khi mà người có nó sẽ đỡ đau hơn. Đấy. Sau này tôi sẽ test ra nhé xem. Xịt rất là sạch luôn. Xịt chuông, xịt chạy thì nó kêu bằng nhớ chạy này cũng được này. Đấy. Anh em thấy ok không? Đấy, xịt rất là sạch luôn. Đấy. Và những cái đó tôi rất thích, tôi tắm cho bằng cái máy phun trường này. Đấy, đây, đó tôi chuồng nó phá không còn cái gì luôn. là chế độ này là khụt xe, và nó có chế độ một vòi xịt như này thì vào người nó chỉ có là nó sẽ đau và rát. Để xịt xe, xịt pháo, xịt chuồng, xịt trại, bắn mình xịt đi sạch sẽ vệ sinh, đỡ thì mình dội nước quét hoặc là lau chùi. Đây là chế độ tắm cho các em nó. Đấy, chế độ xòe phun mưa. Đấy, đấy. Và tôi để tôi này. Thường tắm. Đấy, rồi. Chế độ thứ hai. Đấy. Tắm cho các em nó đây. Rất thích tắm ở chế độ này. Đấy, xịt rất tiện. Trưa nắng anh em có thể mang cái máy này ra, những dây nó dài mà có thể cuốn lại và tắm lên cho em nó. Rất sướng, trưa nắng này, tắm táp. Đây em vừa tiện dụng, mình không phải bấm chân bấm tay được. Đấy. Tắm như này cho các em nó khá là mình bỏ ra chút thời gian 5-7 phút thôi, tắm là ok ngay. Nó sạch sẽ như vậy nhé, sạch sẽ rất nhiều người yêu. Các em cũng là thế, đi được nhốt cái này mà lúc nào phải sạch sẽ, người cũng phải không thơm tho nhưng mà lúc nào cũng được tắm rửa vào những trời nắng này, giải nhiệt cơ thể. Đấy. Chế độ thứ tư thì phun sương rất ổn. Đấy. Rất mát. Các em thấy này là tắm này các em rất thích. Đấy. Tắm cho mát các em rất thích. Đây, có thể những con như này thịt cái trái cây tôi còn luôn. Đấy, trái cây luôn. Tiện đây nhà tôi có cây mít này, làm bóng mát ở cây này. Sau bóng nó sẽ tỏa ra thì các chú chó được mát mẻ hơn. Tôi vừa mới giới thiệu cho anh em qua cách sử dụng và các chế độ của chiếc máy bơm công suất lớn này, là chủ yếu là dùng để rửa xe. Khi xe mình bị bụi bẩn mưa gió về, chúng ta lười ra quán rửa, chúng ta có thể làm ngay một cái máy như vậy để chúng ta mang về nhà chúng ta rửa. Thế thì nó tiện ích hơn, ở nhà mình đỡ phải đi ra ngoài quán ngoài xã rửa. Đấy. Xong cho tất cả anh em.